Karen, a spirited and adventurous tourist from America, was visiting one of Europe's oldest and most revered palaces. The palace, known for its grand architecture and historical significance, attracted visitors from around the globe. Karen, along with a group of friends she had met during her travels, was especially excited about this part of her trip. They spent the morning wandering through lavish rooms and halls adorned with antique furniture and priceless art, each piece telling its own story of royalty and centuries-old events. As the group moved outside, they were greeted by the meticulously maintained palace gardens, with pathways lined by vibrant flower beds and manicured hedges. The air was crisp and the sky a clear blue, perfect for photographs and creating memories. It was here that Karen's attention was drawn to the iconic royal guards stationed around the palace. Dressed in traditional uniforms and known for their discipline and stoicism, these guards were a popular attraction themselves. Intrigued by their unwavering posture and expressionless faces, Karen felt a tickle of curiosity. She had heard stories about these guards, famous for not reacting to tourists' antics aimed at disturbing their composure. As they approached the nearest guard, standing rigid with a ceremonial rifle by his side, one of Karen's newfound friends quipped about how it was impossible to make the guards flinch or even blink. This sparked a playful yet mischievous idea among the group. They joked about who could draw a reaction from the stoic figure first. Laughter and light-hearted banter filled the air as each friend suggested increasingly silly actions to test the guard's resolve. Karen, known in her circle for being the most outgoing and sometimes impulsive, decided that she would be the one to take on the challenge. Her friends pulled out their cameras, ready to capture what they anticipated would be a funny and memorable moment. Encouraged by the attention and caught up in the excitement, Karen stepped forward. She danced a little jig in front of the guard, making funny faces and waving her hands, but the guard remained unmoved, his eyes staring straight ahead. The group's laughter grew louder, fueling Karen's determination to break his stoic demeanor. Unbeknownst to Karen, her next spontaneous decision would escalate far beyond a mere playful joke. As she reached out, her actions were about to turn what was intended as a light-hearted moment into a startling encounter that none of them would forget. Karen's friends were still laughing, their phones pointed at her, waiting to see if she could finally get a reaction from the royal guard. The excitement in the air made her feel bold. She had always been the type of person who enjoyed making people laugh, and this moment felt like the perfect opportunity to do something unforgettable. The idea of challenging the guard's unwavering discipline was thrilling. It was all in good fun, she thought, just a harmless joke. As Karen turned back to her friends, a grin spread across her face. "What if I actually touched the rifle?" she whispered, eyes twinkling with mischief. The group gasped and exchanged nervous glances. "No way," one of them chuckled. "They take their job seriously. You shouldn't mess with them." But Karen shrugged off their concerns. "Come on, it's not like I'm going to take it. Just a little tap. It'll be funny." The laughter around her encouraged her even more. She took a slow step closer to the guard. His tall, rigid frame made him seem almost like a statue. His uniform was pristine, the golden buttons gleaming under the sunlight. The rifle in his hands was held with precision, its polished surface reflecting a hint of light. The fact that he hadn't even blinked at her earlier antics made Karen more determined. Her heart raced with excitement as she extended her hand, just barely brushing her fingers against the cool metal of the rifle. In that split second, the world around her seemed to pause. Karen expected nothing to happen, maybe just a slight reaction, a twitch or a stern glance. But what happened next was nothing like what she had imagined. A sudden movement shattered the stillness. The guard took a sharp step forward, his boots striking the ground with a loud, commanding thud. His voice, firm and authoritative, rang out in the open air. "Stand back." The words cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade. The laughter stopped instantly. Karen's friends, who had been giggling just moments ago, froze with wide eyes, their phones still raised, but now trembling slightly in their hands. Karen stumbled back, her face draining of color. The energy in the air had changed completely. The playful atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The guard's sudden movement had not only startled her, but also everyone nearby. Other tourists turned their heads in shock, whispering among themselves. Karen felt her heart pounding against her chest. She hadn't expected this. It was just a joke, a tiny, harmless touch. But the guard's unwavering posture and firm voice made it clear that this was no laughing matter. The realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just any ordinary job for them. The guards were not there for entertainment. They were there to protect something far bigger than a group of tourists looking for a fun video. As Karen stood frozen in place, she had no idea that things were only about to get worse. The moment the royal guard stepped forward, Karen's heart nearly leaped out of her chest. The loud stomp of his boot echoed through the palace grounds, and for the first time since she arrived, she realized just how serious this was. The guard's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air like a blade. "Step back," he repeated, his tone firm and unshaken. Karen's friends, who had been giggling just moments ago, were now frozen in shock. The fun and laughter drained from their faces as they stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before them. The other tourists around the area turned their heads, some whispering to each other, others raising their phones to capture the moment. It was no longer just a joke. It was a spectacle. Karen instinctively took a step back, raising her hands in the air to show that she meant no harm. I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But the guard remained stone-faced, his posture rigid, his eyes locked straight ahead. His discipline was unshaken, but his message was clear. This was no game. Before Karen could say anything else, the situation took an even more serious turn. Another guard, stationed just a few feet away, suddenly moved toward her. This one carried the same intimidating presence, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. His pace was deliberate, calculated. Karen's stomach twisted in knots. The tourists nearby began murmuring louder, some stepping back while others leaned in, eager to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on Karen like a weight she hadn't felt before. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. She had broken an unspoken rule, a line that should never have been crossed. Karen's mind raced. Should she apologize? Should she run? No, running would make things worse. She glanced at her friends, looking for help, but they were too stunned to do anything. Some of them still held their phones up, but their hands were shaking. The excitement they had a few minutes ago was completely gone. Now, all that remained was an overwhelming sense of fear. The second guard stopped just inches away from her, his face expressionless. Then, in a voice just as firm as the first guard's, he spoke. "Do not touch the guard's weapon. Step away immediately." His words were not a request. They were an order. Karen felt a lump in her throat. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had always been the fun one, the one who made people laugh, the one who got away with harmless pranks. But now, standing before the two towering guards, she realized this was different. There was no laughing this off. There was no playful banter that could fix this. The seriousness of her mistake hit her like a crashing wave. She wasn't just a tourist anymore. She was someone who had just disrespected one of the strictest traditions in the world. And now, she had to face the consequences. Karen's breath caught in her throat as the second guard's words settled in. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as if her body still hadn't caught up with her mind. She hadn't meant any harm, just a little joke to entertain her friends. But now, standing between two towering figures of discipline and duty, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. The crowd around her grew restless. Tourists whispered to one another, some gasping at the unfolding scene. A few had even stepped back, wary of what might happen next. The once lighthearted atmosphere had turned tense, the weight of Karen's mistake pressing down on everyone watching. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say, her voice smaller than she intended. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what else to do. What was the right way to fix this? The second guard didn't react. He simply turned his head slightly, signaling to someone out of Karen's view. That was when she heard it. Heavy footsteps approaching fast. More guards. Her stomach twisted in fear. This was escalating way beyond what she had expected. This wasn't like getting caught breaking a small rule at a museum or sneaking a picture where it wasn't allowed. She had crossed a line, one that was clearly taken very seriously. Within moments, 2 additional guards arrived, their uniforms as immaculate as the first 2. They didn't shout, didn't rush. There was no chaos in their movements. But their presence alone was enough to make Karen's hands start to shake. She wanted to explain, to say it was all just a misunderstanding. But she couldn't find the words. One of the new guards, a taller man with sharp features, stopped directly in front of her. His voice was calm, but firm. "You have interfered with the duty of a royal guard," he said. "This is not a matter to be taken lightly." Karen felt her face flush with heat. Her friends were still standing off to the side, watching in stunned silence. She had expected them to laugh, to maybe come to her defense. But no one spoke. They knew, just as she did now, that this was serious. The first guard, the one she had originally tried to provoke, hadn't moved again. He stood tall, rifle still in position, his eyes locked straight ahead, as if she wasn't even there. That, in itself, was unsettling. It made her realize just how much discipline and training these guards must have. They weren't actors in some tourist attraction. They were protectors of something much larger than her fleeting amusement. "Come with us," the taller guard said. Karen's heart nearly stopped. Was she being arrested? Her mind raced. What did that even mean? A fine? A night in jail? Would she be banned from the country? She turned to her friends, hoping for some kind of lifeline, but they only looked back at her with the same fear she felt. This was no longer just a joke. This was real. Karen's legs felt weak as she followed the guards, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The crowd of tourists watched in stunned silence, some whispering among themselves while others recorded the moment. The weight of their stares made her feel even smaller. Just minutes ago, she had been laughing with her friends, enjoying a fun-filled day at the palace. Now she was walking alongside uniformed officers, unsure of what was going to happen next. She stole a quick glance at her friends, hoping one of them would step in, say something, do something. But they stood frozen in place. The shock on their faces was evident. This wasn't some prank gone wrong. This was something much bigger. No one wanted to make the situation worse. The guards led her away from the main courtyard and toward a gated area near the side of the palace. She swallowed hard, realizing that this was no small scolding. This was official. The towering gates loomed ahead, and as they opened, she felt as though she were stepping into a completely different world, one where her actions had real consequences. Inside the security office, the air was cool, the walls lined with monitors showing various parts of the palace grounds. A stern-looking officer sat behind a desk, his gaze piercing as he looked up at her. The room was quiet except for the faint crackle of a radio in the background. "State your name," the officer said. Karen hesitated before giving it, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mind raced with worry. Was she about to be fined? Deported? Jailed? She had never been in trouble like this before. This was supposed to be a fun trip, one to remember. But now, she wished she could take everything back. The officer studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Do you understand why you are here?" She nodded quickly. I didn't mean any harm," she said, her voice shaking. "It was just a joke. I didn't think." "That's the problem," the officer interrupted. "You didn't think." His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm enough to send a chill down her spine. "The royal guards are not performers. They are here for security. Tampering with their weapons, even as a joke, is not acceptable." Karen's stomach twisted with guilt. She knew he was right. What she thought was harmless fun had actually been reckless and disrespectful. She had treated the guards as part of the tourist experience, forgetting that their duty was real, not some act for entertainment. She lowered her head, unable to meet the officer's gaze. "I'm really sorry," she said, and this time, she meant it. The officer let out a slow breath. "Your actions have consequences. You will have to wait while we decide how to proceed." Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure what that meant, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. Karen sat in a hard, uncomfortable chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The officer behind the desk had returned to his work, clicking away at his computer, but the silence in the room was deafening. Every so often, Karen would glance up at the clock on the wall, only to find that only a few minutes had passed. It felt like hours. Her mind kept racing, replaying the events that had led her here. How had something so simple, so harmless in her mind, escalated so quickly? She couldn't believe she was sitting in this sterile room, a far cry from the lively atmosphere of the palace courtyard. A guard occasionally passed by the open door, casting a brief glance at her before moving on. Karen felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her each time. She had never thought of herself as someone who would get into serious trouble, but now, everything felt different. The reality of the situation was starting to settle in, and with it, a sense of dread. She thought about her friends. They had been with her every step of the way, but now they were outside, waiting anxiously. Had they been questioned too? Were they in trouble as well? Karen hadn't seen them since she was led away, but she could imagine the worried looks on their faces. They hadn't done anything wrong, but by association, they might have to deal with the consequences too. The guilt weighed heavily on her. What if this ended up ruining their entire trip? As if on cue, the door to the office opened. The officer who had spoken to her earlier walked in, his expression still serious. Behind him, another guard entered, carrying a thick folder in his hands. Karen's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was she about to find out her fate? The officer motioned for her to stand. Her legs felt unsteady, but she pushed herself up, trying to maintain what little composure she had left. The two men stood in front of her, exchanging a few quiet words before the officer turned back to her. "We've reviewed the situation," he said, his voice measured and calm. "You've broken a serious protocol. The Royal Guards have specific duties, and your actions today compromise their ability to carry out those duties without distraction. You also physically interfered with a weapon that is considered part of a national security effort." Karen swallowed hard, feeling her chest tighten. Every word he spoke made her feel smaller, more insignificant. She had never imagined that touching the rifle, something that seemed so minor in her eyes, would have such a massive impact. She felt like she was in over her head, out of her depth, and completely powerless. However, the officer continued, "The palace security is willing to offer you a warning instead of a fine or more severe consequences." Karen's breath caught in her throat. A warning. She wasn't going to be arrested, wasn't going to face charges. It was a relief, but it didn't erase the embarrassment, the shame of the situation. She had still messed up, and no matter how they framed it, it felt like she had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "You are to leave the palace grounds immediately," the officer added. "You will not be permitted to return for the remainder of the day. Any further incident could result in a fine or banishment from the country." Karen nodded quickly, her throat tight as she tried to absorb everything. She was being let off easy, but she couldn't shake the weight of the situation. She had nearly ruined everything. The officer handed her a piece of paper with instructions on how to leave the grounds, then gave her one final, stern look. "Learn from this, miss. Next time, think before you act." Karen nodded again, this time more vigorously. "I understand," she murmured. The officer motioned toward the door. "You're free to go. Please don't make the same mistake again." As Karen stepped out of the room, her legs felt like jelly. She was free, But the reality of the day's events still lingered in her mind. The palace was no longer the beautiful, majestic place it had seemed earlier. It now felt cold and distant, a reminder of how a simple decision had spiraled into something much more serious. Karen walked slowly out of the security office, her mind still spinning from everything that had happened. The words, "next time, think before you act," echoed in her head. She had never expected her day at the palace to end like this. The once familiar, beautiful surroundings now seemed foreign and distant. The laughter and excitement she had felt earlier in the day were now replaced with a deep sense of shame and confusion. As she walked back toward the entrance, her heart still raced, and the tension in her shoulders refused to ease. She had been warned, not arrested, but the idea of what might have happened still haunted her. What if the guards hadn't been so lenient? What if she had faced a fine or worse, been banned from the country altogether? The relief she felt was tempered by the constant replaying of her mistake in her mind. Karen finally reached the gate where she had been let in earlier. The guards there, still standing tall and firm, watched her as she passed. She avoided their gazes, feeling small and insignificant. Her hands fidgeted in her pockets, and she tried to ignore the stares of the other tourists who had watched her earlier and now looked at her with quiet curiosity. Her mind was filled with what-ifs, imagining how things could have gone in another direction if she had just thought things through. Outside the gate, she spotted her friends, their faces filled with a mix of relief and concern. They rushed to her as soon as they saw her. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, her voice filled with genuine worry. "We were getting really worried about you." Karen nodded, forcing a smile, though she knew it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Just a little shaken." "What happened in there?" another friend asked, her eyes wide. "They didn't arrest you, did they?" No, Karen said, shaking her head. "But it was close. I messed up. I touched the rifle. And that's against the rules." Her friends exchanged worried glances, clearly unsure of how to respond. They hadn't been part of the scene in the security office, and Karen knew they couldn't fully understand the gravity of what had just happened. It had been a joke gone wrong, an innocent, albeit careless, moment that had spiraled into something far more serious. "We just need to leave," Karen added, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've already been told to go, and I don't want to risk anything else happening." The group agreed without hesitation, knowing that Karen wasn't in the mood to linger or face any more consequences. As they made their way toward the exit, Karen kept her head low, trying to keep to herself. She couldn't help but feel like everyone who saw her knew what she had done, like they could somehow see the mistake written all over her face. The weight of the day's events clung to her, and she wished more than anything that she could just erase it all from her memory. When they finally reached the street outside the palace, Karen took a deep breath. The fresh air felt good against her face, but the unsettling feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and regret. It wasn't just about the incident itself. It was about how easily she had let her impulsive nature take over. She had never thought something so small would snowball into such a big problem. Her friends tried to comfort her, but their words barely reached her. Karen couldn't stop replaying the moment when the guards had stepped toward her, the moment when she had realized how wrong she was. The consequences of her actions weren't something she could just brush off. She had learned a hard lesson today, one that she wouldn't forget. As they walked away from the palace, Karen knew that this experience would stay with her for a long time. The memory of the royal guards, the warning she had received, and the gravity of what she had almost done would all be a reminder to think before acting, and to never again underestimate the seriousness of something she thought was a harmless joke. Karen's mind remained clouded as she and her friends made their way through the bustling streets outside the palace. The grand building stood tall behind them, a reminder of the day's events, but all she could focus on was the feeling of regret that seemed to have settled into her bones. She tried to shake it off, but it clung to her, weighing her down with every step she took. Her friends were still talking, trying to keep the mood light, but Karen felt distant, as if a part of her had been left back in that cold, sterile security office. "So, what now?" one of her friends asked, looking at Karen with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Are we heading back to the hotel?" Karen paused for a moment, taking in the question. The lightheartedness of her friends' voices seemed so far away from the seriousness of what she had just experienced. She wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't even fully processed what had happened, but she knew she couldn't let it ruin the rest of the trip. "I don't know," Karen replied quietly. "Maybe we should just take a walk. I need some time to think." Her friends nodded understandingly, sensing the heaviness that hung around her. They didn't press her further, and instead, they walked in silence for a while, the hum of the city surrounding them. The chatter of tourists, the sound of distant laughter, and the bustle of the busy streets were all still there, but it felt distant to Karen. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her head, the look on the guards' faces, the way they had reacted, the way she had felt so small and out of control. The world around her seemed so normal, so unchanged, yet she felt different. What had once been a carefree day of exploration had been transformed into an experience she would never forget. "I just didn't realize," Karen said after a long pause, speaking aloud to herself more than to anyone else. "It was just supposed to be a silly thing, you know. But I didn't realize how serious it was. I never thought something so small could cause so much trouble." Her friends exchanged looks but said nothing. They didn't need to. They understood. Everyone made mistakes, but this one had been particularly eye-opening. After a while, they found a quiet spot near a small cafe and sat down. The noise of the city seemed to fade as they settled into their seats. For the first time since the incident, Karen began to relax a little. The warm sunlight and the gentle breeze seemed to soften her anxiety. She let out a deep breath, realizing how tense she had been for the past several hours. As they sipped their drinks and chatted, Karen's mind wandered back to the events of the day. The warning from the officer echoed in her thoughts, but instead of feeling bitter about it, she began to feel a sense of gratitude. She could have faced a much harsher punishment, but instead, she had been given a second chance, a rare gift, considering the seriousness of the situation. She knew this experience would change her. It wasn't just about the mistake she had made. It was about the lesson she had learned. It was a reminder of how important it was to think before acting, to always consider the consequences of her actions, no matter how harmless they might seem at first. As they finished their drinks and started to head back to the hotel, Karen felt a small sense of peace return to her. The incident hadn't ruined her entire trip, but it had changed her. She wouldn't forget the lesson she had learned today. And next time, she would be sure to think carefully before making any decisions, no matter how small or playful they seemed. The palace was behind her now, but the lesson it had taught her would stay with her forever.